Generic drugs, are they as good as the brand name? And a retrospective of Justice Potter Stewart.
Generic drugs are cheaper than brand name drugs, but are they safe or as good? That is the question the American Medical Association House of Delegates voted this week to study, and the one we focus on now. First, with some background from correspondent June Cross.
1 second here, let me just get my prescription out, okay?
Getting a prescription and having it filled at the neighborhood drugstore are things so routine, most Americans hardly think about what's in the pills they get. That's been changing. Increasingly, generic drugs are entering the marketplace. They're the chemical equivalent of brand names, but they're about a third cheaper. And their arrival on the market has meant confusion for consumers because the generics have different names, and they may even look different. What's more, some medical professionals think generics are less effective than their brand name counterparts.
There are some generic drugs that do not have the same bioavailability, or they're not distributed as evenly in the system as brand name drugs.
Hal Schechner has been a New York City pharmacist for the last 30 years. He says he rarely dispenses generic drugs.
We have a certain number of brand name companies that we know we've relied on in the past, but the profusion of generic companies is so great that we can't possibly decide which is good, which is bad, without scientific facts.
Pharmacists like Schechner rely on the Food and Drug Administration to test generic drugs for their effectiveness. The generics are supposed to have the same active ingredients as the brand name, but they're not required to have the same amounts of those ingredients. In fact, FDA tests allow for a 30% deviation. That means patients have to rely on their doctor's advice about which generics are acceptable substitutions. But the laws about acceptable generics and who can dispense them vary from state to state. Dr. Ronald Rizzore and Dr. Richard Shepard both practice general medicine at the same clinic in New York City. In New York, it's not the pharmacist, but the doctor who decides whether the patient will get a brand name drug. And Dr. Rizzore usually prescribes the brand name. He says he does it to be sure of quality.
I want to be sure of what I'm using, and I'm not always that way with the generics.
But Dr. Richard Shepard says cost considerations lead him to prescribe generic drugs.
I try to keep the patient's pocketbook in mind, and in general, that means to write for a generic drug when possible and when I think it's appropriate and will be as effective as the brand name drug for the patient.
Dr. Shepard also says there are some patients for whom he wouldn't prescribe generics.
A patient with a serious and unstable, say, medical problem, a very delicate problem, especially the cardiovascular system or the respiratory tract, say angina or high blood pressure, heart failure, asthma, I would be more inclined to write for a brand name, one that I know and trust.
Still, generic drugs captured 20% of the prescription drug market last year, nearly $4 billion in sales, helped by the FDA's accelerated testing program and pressures from consumers to keep medical costs down. Cost-conscious consumers may be better off in states like Connecticut when they go to get their prescriptions filled. That's because the state law here gives the pharmacist greater leeway in choosing between a brand name or a generic drug. Brendan Lawler is a pharmacist in Stamford, Connecticut. Connecticut pays its pharmacists a small bonus to dispense generic drugs, and Lawler says he feels personally responsible for ensuring the quality of the drugs he sells.
When I'm ready to buy a generic, if I have a need of buying lots of generics for a particular reason, I will investigate the company. I'll ask them for their bioavailability studies, and if they come up to what I feel are the standards necessary for the drug I'm dispensing, I'll buy from them.
But Harold Schechner, the New York City pharmacist, says there should be greater safeguards on the manufacture of generics.
I believe that there should be greater controls on the generic drugs and a uniform guide as to which particular companies can be depended on for their scientific product and their bioavailability of the product.
It was these concerns that led the American Medical Association yesterday to initiate a study into the quality of generic drugs. Whatever the outcome of that study, one thing is certain. Consumers are going to have to be more aware of what they're getting in their prescription drugs.
That report by June Cross. The AMA isn't the only medical group with concerns about generic drugs. Leaders of the American Academy of Family Physicians have also raised serious questions about them. One of the critics is Dr. Alan Bruckheim, a New Jersey physician who formerly headed a committee on generics and other drugs for the Family Physicians Group. And here to defend generic drugs is Dr. Peter Rheinstein, head of the Office of Drug Standards for the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Bruckheim, I'm going to begin with you. If a generic drug has the same active ingredient as the brand name, why wouldn't it work exactly the same way? What would the concern be?
There are many reasons. First of all, the active ingredient, which is a chemical, can be contained in various other chemicals or inert things or gelatins, which dissolve at different rates within the body and do not release the amount of chemical that we need or we expect in a brand name drug. There are marked differences, differences which have been recognized both in the clinical sphere as well as in the testing sphere.
Why does this happen? I mean, is there a reason why there's that much variation from one drug to another? Aren't they supposed to be the same?
They're supposed to be, and everyone has bought that we get the same drug for less of a price in generic drugs, and it just isn't so. By whatever means those prescription drugs which are generic are produced in the active person, when we give it to the person who is ill, they don't always have the same effect that we have come to expect from the brand name drug. And it's that lack of effectiveness that we find in the clinical state which has caused us so much concern.
Where does the fault lie here?
I don't know that there's a fault. I think that there has been a gapping between the production in the pharmaceutical manufacturers who innovated the drug, who went through 6 years of testing to produce the sufficient documentation for the FDA, and the new regulations which affect the FDA in approving generic drugs. There's a large difference, a great deal of difference between the two approval processes.
And why is the difference there?
Because a law was passed. In 1984, an amendment was made to the FDA regulations which changed the way that the FDA was to address the generic problem and the manner in which they approved generic drugs for use.
And just to sum up, I mean, how much difference does all this make?
It makes a great deal of difference in that, one, physicians are concerned about the fact that we haven't realized the dream of cheaper medications for our patients. We have a lack of confidence in the approval mechanism which is now in place in the FDA, and we really have a fear, a deep down fear that our patients may be caused unnecessary suffering because the medications that are generic may not be as effective.
Dr. Rheinstein, let me turn to you. He says there's a real fear about the health of these patients because the generic drugs may not be as effective.
I think the fear is unfounded, but before I reply to that, let me reply to something I heard a little bit earlier, which was someone saying that there's a 30% variation in the amount of drug in a generic. That's simply not true. The content uniformity, the amount of drug in a generic, has the same tolerance as the amount of drug in the brand name product. The 30% figure comes from...
What do you mean? I'm sorry, percent of tolerance. What do you mean by tolerance?
The variability of the amount of actual active ingredient within the tablet or capsule. It's very small. It's only a few percent, and it's the same for the innovator and the generic.
So you're saying there's not that much difference?
Right. I'm saying the 30% figure actually comes from something else. It comes from the mechanism that is used to approve generic drugs. The theory under which...
I mean, is that something we need to understand in order to
Yes, I think very much so. I think you need to know how FDA approves generic drugs and what kinds of testing are done.
All right, we'll let you explain it then.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. What we do, we believe that if an active ingredient gets into the bloodstream at the same rate and to the same extent, then it will produce the same effect. In other words, when you take a tablet or capsule or a liquid, what happens is the active ingredient is absorbed through the stomach, goes into the bloodstream, and then is ultimately delivered to the place in your body that it's going to do something. There is a common pathway then Once the active ingredient gets into the bloodstream at that rate and extent, it's totally separated from the dosage form, totally separated from the other elements of the tablet or capsule. And it's the same thing whether it's made by one manufacturer or made by a different manufacturer.
So the thrust of what you're saying is what? That even though you're taking the same dosage of the generic drug as, say, you are of brand AB, then what? It may not have the same effect in the body. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying it does have the same effect.
It does have the same effect.
I'm saying that the testing that we require generic companies to do is to administer their dosage form, give the tablet, give the capsule, and then at specified times after that capsule or tablet is taken, they take blood samples and they analyze how much of the active ingredient has found its way into the bloodstream. From that, we can calculate the rate at which the drug is being absorbed from the stomach, and we can figure out how much of the drug is absorbed.
So you're saying you go to great lengths to see that these generic drugs have the same effect on patients as the brand name drugs. Is that correct? How do you account then for the discrepancies that Dr. Bruckheim and others are mentioning here?
Well, I should say that we do not know of any documented incidents of therapeutic failure with a drug that has been approved by FDA and coded as substitutable. FDA publishes a book of therapeutic equivalency determinations, and some older generics have what is called a B rating, which means they're fine as long as one stays on the same brand. In other words, one may stay on the innovator or one may stay on the generic, but should not switch back and forth. But most generics are in fact coded A, and that means that one can substitute between one brand.
So you're saying
another.
there's no problem as far as you're concerned? Is that,
we,
I mean, just
we know of no problem where the drugs are FDA approved and rated as therapeutically equivalent.
Dr. Bruckheim, you heard what he said.
I heard what he said. The testing process isn't quite as accurate as doctor would like to have it. There are three areas of contention that physicians have about this testing process. Number one, the new drug application of generics, which is an abridged one and so-called an ANDA, is using between 18 and 25 healthy young men to test the drug product in. These are not sufferers from the disease. They are young, healthy individuals who must be within 10% of their normal weight in order to be used in this test. The tests are not conducted in individuals who have the disease. We don't know whether the therapeutic effect of the drug will be the same. And last but not least, they're using a rule that they call 75-75. That means that in 3 out of 4 cases, the drug must be within the limits of 75% to 125% of the brand name that it's being compared with. Now, that's a 50% gap, so that sometimes the drug may give less than we expect, and sometimes it can give more. Now, which drug does what, we don't know, because we don't really know where the generics come from many of the times when we prescribe brand names.
He says there's a lot more uncertainty than you're willing to acknowledge.
Well, then I think the uncertainty applies also to the innovators' marketed dosage forms. What Dr. Bruckheim didn't say when he talked about the 6 years of testing done by brand name companies is that that testing is not done on the tablet or capsule that is eventually marketed, the one that you can buy at the pharmacy. It's done on specially formulated materials that are made in advance of any marketed dosage form. Usually the active ingredient is ground up and put into a capsule, and the comparison drug, or the placebo, is also ground up and put into a matching capsule, and that's how we do the double-blind studies.
So how does that relate to what we're discussing here?
Well, once the innovator company has used these specially made-up dosage forms to show that the particular active ingredient is useful in treating a particular disease, the way they go from that clinical testing to their marketed dosage form is a bioequivalence study. Exactly the same study.
In layman's terms, that means what?
Well, exactly the same study in 18 to 24 patients showing that the rate and extent to which the active ingredient is absorbed into the bloodstream is the same for what the company proposes to market as what was originally tested.
Okay, I guess you've lost me, but I'm sure that's my fault and not yours. Let me ask you this, Dr. Bruckheim. Can you think of any instances in which a generic drug is okay?
Yes, when I've used it before, And when I've talked to Brendan Lawler, who you just had on your show, and found out where the drug is coming from, what company is producing it, and I know that I'm going to get the same generic each and every time I send that prescription to my local pharmacist. When I have gained the confidence that that drug is the same each and every time I use it, with as many patients as I need it, I can then feel confident inside of myself that the patient will get the best of all possible deals, quality medication at a lower cost.
And let me ask sort of you the reverse question, Dr. Rheinstein. Are there instances where you say it's not okay to use a generic, where one should stick with the brand name?
Yes, prior to 1984, we approved some generics on the basis of a showing of bioavailability, but they were not necessarily tested against the innovator drug product. That means that you can titrate a patient.
I'm sorry, you've got to use language I can understand.
You can put a patient on a certain dose of the generic, and you can keep that patient on the generic, and he will do well. But you should not then switch him back to the brand name, nor should you switch from the brand name to the generic.
Now, in what instance is this when it's not all right to switch?
These are drugs which were approved before we required bioequivalence testing.
I see, before the additional testing. Let me, just to begin to sum up, Dr. Bruckheim, what do you think should be done to remedy what you see as a problem here?
All right, physicians have become very well informed by a series of articles which appeared in Medical Tribune, and Nat Horowitz has written a great deal about it, and he's gotten quotes from the FDA which really indicate to us, the medical public who have read these articles, that there are some doubts within the FDA itself as to whether the process by which they're approving generic drugs is truly tenable. I would like to suggest that a double-blind study be performed. That means that the patient doesn't know which drug they're getting, nor does the physician know which drug is being given, and they be given these populations, two populations, one get the generic, one get the name brand or the producer that originally came on the market. And let's see, at the end of this process, whether one drug hasn't been more effective than the other. The patients will not be at risk because, according to the FDA, they will be receiving equal kinds of medications, substitutable mechanism.
And
now,
in the meantime, before those tests are done, what should patients be doing right now? Should they not try generic drugs? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the medical process of care doesn't end up with just a prescription. The cost of evaluation, examination, testing is a long one, and we put a lot of time and trouble into it. The few dollars that might be saved on a prescription of which we are uncertain really isn't worth it.
You have a few seconds to respond here, Dr.
Well, I would hope that doctors would take time to familiarize themselves with the generic drug approval process, that doctors and pharmacists would take some time to learn about the rating system of therapeutic equivalence or non-equivalence, and base their prescribing decisions on that, and when they can save their patients money, to the extent that they can, do that.
I have a feeling, gentlemen, we didn't get too much closer on this issue tonight, but we thank you both, Dr. Rheinstein, Dr. Bruckheim, for being with us.
Thank you.